Hey everybody, this is Erica, the technology nerd who likes to film stuff, and I'm in the process of reviewing the OnePlus 6. Now, as I go along, I've been discovering some interesting things, particularly about the camera and video stabilization that you may not know, as these things weren't obvious in the press event or in the specs. So I have a feeling that many reviewers are going to miss this as well, so let's take a look. So in my hands-on video, I told you guys that even though the main camera has optical image stabilization, known as OIS, it's actually not used to stabilize video. Instead of OIS in video, electronic image stabilization tied to the gyroscope is used. This was information I got from my OnePlus contact, and this is still true, it's just not the whole story. It turns out that OIS is used exclusively in some video modes, and EIS is used exclusively in other video modes. So we'll start off looking at this from a spec standpoint, then I will show you what's really going on. And I did confirm all of this with OnePlus and tested this myself. So the OnePlus 6 has two cameras. The main camera is 16 megapixels with OIS and EIS, an f1.7 aperture, and a 19% larger sensor. And the main camera is used for taking pictures and taking video. Then we have the secondary camera, and that is 20 megapixels, doesn't include stabilization, and is used to both provide depth information for the portrait mode, as well as help enhance detail in photos from the main camera. So I like to call this camera the helper camera. So just to make this clear, the second camera is not used for 2x optical zoom, as the zoom is digital from the main camera, or for low light like in the past. So when we go to take pictures, optical image stabilization is enabled, and you can see the camera floating about to counter movement while under the photos mode. And if you guys don't know what OIS does, it helps to take clear photos free of motion blur, and also assists with lower light photos so that the shutter can stay open longer. So that's for the picture mode, but when we go into video mode, it's a different story. Sometimes it uses OIS only, and other times it uses EIS only. And note that optical image stabilization and electronic image stabilizations are never combined. So when you open the camera and you're on the 30 frames per second modes like 1080p and 4K, you will see that the optical image stabilization is off. And yes, you can turn off OIS despite erroneous belief that you can't. And you can tell this because the camera is no longer countering my movements. So in this case, EIS is being used. And I do think using EIS instead of OIS can be a good thing because digital stabilization can reduce movements that optical image stabilization on these tiny cameras cannot. Now keep in mind that using EIS alone is not surprising because even Google used EIS only in the past on the Pixel, and their result was great for video stabilization. Now when you go underneath the 60 frame per second modes, you can see that OIS kicks in again. So here you can see the camera is moving about to counter my movements. Now only the 1080p 60 frames per second and 4K 60 frames per second use optical image stabilization. All the other modes use EIS. So after explaining all of this, let's see what this actually looks like, and the difference is really obvious. Truthfully, I like EIS better. So when optical image stabilization is being used inside 60 frames per second modes, I noticed that it looks kind of herky-jerky. And the 30 FPS modes with EIS look a lot more smooth. I do notice that the electronic image stabilized video is cropped and definitely not as sharp. And also, depending on the amount of lighting, the result can break down and look like it's vibrating a bit during movement, but it looks great in bright lighting. It's almost like it's floating. So in this bright example, you can't tell at all that I'm shaking the camera, and I was actually moving it pretty substantially. The result is really quite awesome and telling as to why EIS is being used in modes people will most likely use the most. Then taking a look back at 4K 60 frames per second again, it's really not so good. The question I have is, why isn't OnePlus using EIS for all the modes? Is there some kind of limitation for 60 frames per second with using the gyroscope? So I'm going to investigate this further. Hopefully I'll hear back from OnePlus, but I found this really interesting. My thought on why they're using two different types of stabilization is that OIS is more for pictures where EIS is more intended for video. At least that looks to be where they're getting the best results. So as a wrap up to all of this, 3 of 5 modes use EIS and the other 2 use OIS. And for my testing, I can see that OIS looks to be inferior, but has a sharper image and isn't cropped. And also, unlike the EIS modes, I don't see the image degrade depending on the lighting, but it does look quite jerky during my walking tests. Now as for the EIS modes, it looks phenomenal in perfect lighting. It's almost like the image is floating, but quickly breaks down to looking very vibrating in the shade. So as you can see from this, neither stabilization method is perfect, and at least knowing this, you can choose the best setting for your needs. I'd say when not moving a lot, I'm going to use 60 frame per second modes so I can use the OIS. That way the image isn't cropped. And when there's a lot of movement and the lighting is really great, I will use the 30 frames per second mode so it can be nice and smooth. So I hope that this little tidbit helps. This has been Erica, the technology nerd who likes to film stuff. Please rate, comment, and subscribe, and let me know if you like these little pre-review tidbits. And have a good day.